Well, today's kind of a weird Sunday. We're at the end of fall, but not quite at Christmas yet. Next Sunday, we celebrate Christ the King, and the week after that, Advent starts. This week is Thanksgiving, and that's sort of today's theme, but there are no turkeys in Scripture. So our readings for today talk about Jesus coming back to earth at the end of time, which is usually something we hear about in Advent. So we could consider today a sneak preview of Advent. So at this time of year, when the days are getting shorter and the weather is getting colder and the rain is turning into snowflakes, I think a message of encouragement would be a good thing. And out of the two readings for today, Paul's words in 1 Thessalonians are more encouraging, so I'm going to leave Paul for last and start with the story from Matthew. So our reading in Matthew is a familiar parable. It's one that Jesus told the disciples a day or two before he died on the cross. So in a sense, these are a dying man's last words. There are, in Matthew chapter 25, there are actually three parables, and together they make up Jesus' final instructions to the disciples and to us on how to live a life of faith when Jesus is no longer here on the earth in the flesh. And so to just kind of fill in this chapter briefly, the first parable in the chapter is the story of the wise and foolish bridesmaids. Did you all get that last week? I'm not sure. That might have been one of the readings for last week. I'm not sure. But anyway, so the 10 foolish bridesmaids, 5 of whom took extra oil with them, and 5 of whom did not. And when the groom who was running late finally arrived, the 5 who didn't bring extra oil ran out of oil and had to go get more, and they ended up being locked out of the wedding feast. So that's the first parable. And then there's the one we just heard. And then the third parable in the chapter is the story of the lambs and the goats on Judgment Day. And the king says to the lambs on his right hand, "Welcome into my Father's kingdom, for I was hungry and thirsty and naked and sick and in prison, and you took care of me." And then he says to the goats on his left, "Depart from me, evildoers, because you didn't do these things." And both the sheep and the goats say, "When did we ever do this or not do this?" And Jesus answered, "Just as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, or didn't do it, you did it or didn't do it to me." And that's the third parable. So you get the 3 parables then lining up in Matthew chapter 25 that tell us that what we do with our lives matters. I mean, yes, we are saved by grace. We are saved by grace through faith. Salvation is totally a gift from God, and these stories don't change that. But as Martin Luther pointed out, faith without works is dead. And because if we really believe what we believe in, will show up in how we live. And so today's parable about the 3 servants and their talents reinforces this point. So looking at the story, it starts out with a rich man, a very rich man, who is going away on a long journey. And while he's away, he wants his servants to take over management of what he owns, all of his wealth. And the master, of course, represents God, and the servants represent us, not just us here, but all people. As for what the talents represent, well, in Jesus' day, a talent was a measure of weight that was used to weigh things like gold and silver and bronze, precious metals. And we don't know for sure exactly what a talent was worth. But in this story, basically, each servant is given basically a lifetime's wages. A lot of money. And that amount varies from servant to servant, just as it would for us. Different gifts, different careers, different finances. The talents then represent what God has given us. And we're talking about that with the kids. Our bodies, our minds, our hearts, our souls, our families, our abilities, all the things that make up who we are. And these gifts are all God's. They belong to God, but God hands them over to our care as his servants. And he gives some of us 5 and some of us 2 and some of us 1. Now, is God playing favorites here? No. God knows each person and gives what's appropriate to each person, what we can handle, no more, no less. Having more talents does not make someone a better person. It just means that person's got more to do, okay? And having fewer talents does not mean that a person's efforts are unimportant. Remember the story of the widow's mite. Jesus said the poor widow who put 2 pennies into the treasury gave more than anyone else because she gave all she had. So it's not about how many talents we have, it's what we do with what we're given. So the first and second servant go out and they trade with their master's talents, and they double what they've been given. The one with 5 talents makes 5 more. The one with 2 talents makes 2 more. But the third servant goes out, buries his money in the ground, and hides it. I'm going to come back to him in a moment. But the rest of the story, you know what this reminds me of? Any of you ever watched Shark Tank? It's a reality show about rich investors called sharks who average people like you and me come onto the show and go to the sharks with business proposals. And if the ideas are good, a shark will invest, giving them money and advice on how to grow the business. And in a matter of years, or sometimes just months, an investment of a few $100,000 turns into a few million. And of course, both the shark and the business owner are thrilled, and they go out and enjoy each other's company. Now, of course, God doesn't need money, but God is an investor. God invests in us. And our job is like those business owners on Shark Tank, to take the talents God gives us and the guidance God gives us and make a profit with it. So what would God consider a profit? Well, all kinds of things. Maybe winning souls to Jesus, maybe giving food and clothing to people after hurricanes, maybe building friendships between people from different countries, maybe bringing justice into an unjust situation, maybe welcoming strangers. Could be any number of things. Through prayer, God guides us in investing the talents we've been given, just what we were talking about earlier. So imagine the joy of standing before God on that day and saying, "Look, you gave me these gifts and I made more." And hearing God say, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master." No matter how many talents we've been given, the reward is the same. Enter into the joy of your master. Well done. So what's up with the guy with 1 talent? Even the kids were amazed at him. Why would you throw money in dirt? I never could figure out where this guy's coming from. I mean, look at the things he says to God. He says, "Master, I knew you were a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you did not scatter. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours." Where does he get this? How does his brain get to the point of saying to God, "You're a hard man," when God is neither hard nor a man? So for those of us who know God, this guy sounds like he's completely out in left field. So where is he coming from? Well, one theologian makes a good point when he says, one way or another, every stubborn sinner ends up blaming his sins on God. In other words, what this man is saying is it's what psychologists would call denial and projection, looking at someone else and seeing a reflection of ourselves instead of what's really in front of us. So servant number 3 blames God for his own shortcomings, insults and falsely accuses God to his face, and then hands him 1 lousy coin covered with dirt. Is it any surprise the master says, "You wicked and lazy servant, the least you could have done was earn me some interest. Take away his talent, give it to the one with the 10, and throw him out into the outer darkness." Bottom line, we do not want to be this guy. We want to see God as God is, the loving Lord, the gracious God, the source of all good things, who wants us to do well and wants us to enter into the joy of our master. And so at this point, then, I want to turn to Paul's letter to the Thessalonians. Paul and his hearers would most likely have known this story that Jesus told. And Paul picks up the theme, saying, "You know the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night." And he says, Paul writes, when they say there's peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them. And I think the they Paul's talking about are those folks with one talent out there. They don't know what God is thinking, and they are false prophets. Paul continues, but you, beloved, are not in darkness. And darkness can represent many things. It can represent lostness, confusion, lack of direction, lack of meaning, lack of purpose, lack of knowledge, lack of connectedness with God. Darkness is where people hide when they don't want to be seen. And darkness is where the guy with the one talent ends up living. But Paul says, you belong to the day. Therefore, he says, since we belong to the day, let us be sober and put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet, the hope of salvation. And I want to look at that equipment just for a moment. Faith and love as a breastplate. That's the piece that kind of goes all the way down to the waist and attaches here. The breastplate, faith and love, protects our hearts. And then the hope of salvation is a helmet. The hope protects our minds. And faith, hope, and love, these three, we've heard this before, right? Will direct us in investing our talents. Paul adds, awake or asleep, then we may live with him. Therefore, encourage one another. Encourage each other to good works, to investing talents wisely, to investing ourselves in God's kingdom. And I think this story is not just for individuals. I think it's for churches too, and for organizations. And so likewise, encourage the church to good works and to expressing faith and hope and love. And I would add, when you see it, say it. If you see someone using their talents or see the church using its talents, say so. Spread the good news. Give thanks to God and give thanks to the people involved. See, I knew I'd get around to Thanksgiving somehow, right? Thanks be to God, who gives us the talents and who gives us the hope and who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.